Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. My guest today is Aiste Klimasauskaite, a researcher at the University of Bergen, Norway, who is working on the political science of deep sea mining. Aiste is very active and engaged on the topic, and I was interested in talking with her about the role of scientists and others in the decision-making space around deep sea mining. We explore why more knowledge doesn't always simplify decisions, how scientific information moves through policymaking, and why misunderstandings arise between scientists, policymakers, industry, and the public. Aiste emphasizes the importance of transparency in science and offers thoughtful reflections on neutrality and advocacy among researchers.
Scientific neutrality doesn't exist. It's just not there. And the better way to approach the question is to basically be very transparent about your position, what you do, why you do it, how you do it.
This is a long one, and we cover a lot of diverse ground. I hope you find it interesting. As always, if you think this podcast is worth sharing, then please share it. If you have suggestions, please reach out to me at eric@elementspod.com. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Aiste Klimasauskaite. Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining, Aiste.
Hello, Eric.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start with your background. Where do you come from? How did you get to be here in Bergen? And how did you originally get involved in deep sea mining?
Yes. So I come from Lithuania, and Lithuania does not have a deep sea. Well, parts of the Baltic Sea, I guess, could be deemed to be deep enough. But my childhood is spent near a lake in a small village, so the deep sea was very far throughout my life and studies. And I actually started my bachelor, my thesis in my bachelor was on corporate identity, which has nothing to do with the sea, basically. But then from my bachelor to my master's to my PhD and my postdoc here at UIB, I kind of moved closer and closer and deeper. So my master's was on coastal zone management, and my PhD was on saltwater desalination for drinking water. So politics of that. Yeah, so I moved from terrestrial landscape to the deep. And yeah, when I started my postdoc here, I didn't plan to actually deep dive into the deep sea question and policy making. But it naturally happened because Norway issued the impact assessment in October 2022, and I started my position in May 2022. So in a very short period of time, I learned that Norway is moving along, and the presentation of the impact assessment for the public in 2022 was quite a crucial step in the whole process for Norway. So it felt like I'm in the middle of these things that are really important.
And you think of yourself as political science? That's like the narrow field that you put yourself in?
Yeah, I have a mix of things. So in my master's, I did environmental studies, which is quite broad, without specific, I would say, disciplinary kind of belonging. So, and in my PhD, I did policy studies, but focused on water politics. And then here I actually am part of the Center for Vetenskapsteori, which is the Center for the Studies of the Sciences and the Humanities.
Okay.
So people in it actually do many different things, but the core base for everyone belonging to the center is philosophy of science or doing research on research. And since I did kind of look into this science for policy context from my master's to my PhD until here, it felt that I am quite in the right place, but I didn't have a background in philosophy of science as such, which is the core thing here, I guess. So I learned a lot here, actually, and yeah.
Yeah, okay, so then that explains what we're going to focus on in our discussion. We're going to talk about the role of science in decision-making, the kind of cross-pollination of science and politics and society and how we get to good decision making. And yeah, I guess the reason I'm talking to you is because I see you as someone who's quite active in the deep sea mining conversation. And so I see you on LinkedIn and also in events happening in the Norwegian conversation. And I'm very interested in understanding the dynamics of the conversation itself around deep sea mining. So I'm interested to get your kind of perception as someone who not only researches and thinks about deep sea mining, but also participates in the debate and experiences that.
Yes. I think it's a good thing to mention why some of the scientists are active.
Yeah.
And maybe the word active is associated with the word activism, which can be perceived as a negative thing. And for many of my colleagues, it feels quite intimidating to actually participate in this public conversation. But I don't see it as activism. Many of us, including me, get my funding comes from the public money. So my research is basically supposed to be for the public in itself. And if it's for the public, I need to, even if I feel uncomfortable, I need to participate in this public conversation in a way. And I mean, there are many debates. Should scientists be neutral and quiet and in their offices, on their boats and, or should they be more active and participate in things? And people find their own answer. I mean, for I can't say everyone should do that. I don't know why other people don't do it. They might have as well very good reasons. But yeah, I do it because I feel that I have to give back, and I cannot sit in my office with the door closed. The conversation in Norway is slightly different from the international seabed, and some of your podcast guests rightfully made the distinction that there is a difference between the international seabed and the national continental shelves that countries have and kind of think of exploring and exploiting. So in Norway, maybe it's less antagonistic compared to international seabed debates. Some parts of that can be quite, how to say, unfriendly maybe. Yeah. But in Norway, I mean, there's a whole spectrum of opinions and ideas why Norway should go for it, why shouldn't it go for it, and people feel like they have good reasons. In the scientific community, there's also quite a broad feeling why or why not, and I think it's reasonable and important to listen to all these voices. But as we spoke before, science in itself is not a decision-making body, or scientific community are not decision makers. So Norway is a democracy, and people expect that their elected politicians and representatives of their communities will make the decisions. So there's a mix of, how science enters that and how it goes.
Okay, so so your perception is that in the Norwegian conversation, it's actually much less antagonism than in the
I would say so, yes.
Do you think that has to do with just the size of the Norwegian kind of deep sea mining population? Like, there's fewer people, you have more opportunity to meet one another, and so you kind of get more opportunity to, I guess, for one, have deeper conversations aside from just kind of reading what people are posting on social media, and then also see the other person more as a person as opposed to a set of opinions that can react to.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to tell. There's probably a mix of reasons, but it does help that, you are contained to one country. Perhaps in Norway, it's more in general acceptable to be less, how to say, anti someone and more just, having a reasonable conversation. Although some people feel, that it is too I don't know what is the good word for it, that it's not such a friendly space to be in. Some people do feel that, they're probably unwelcome in some circles that have an opinion one way or the other.
Yeah. I hadn't planned on asking you this, but it occurs to me to wonder, how many different kind of segments do you see, or coalitions or stakeholder groups in the deep sea mining conversation? Like, I often kind of think, well, there's industry actors, there's government, there's scientists, there's NGOs or activists, and then there's kind of the general public that is more or less engaged. But how do you think about the different groups that you're speaking to, speaking with when you're engaging in the deep sea mining conversation?
Yeah, I think I have a similar kind of divisions or categories of all these people together. But each of these groups by itself is not a homogeneous mass with one single opinion or voice. So I do realize that every segment has, a spectrum of thoughts, what it is about, and should it happen or shouldn't it? And
right, because so you have a lot of connections, but you are kind of in the researcher group, so that your closest connections are kind of people with their science hat on. But then you also have like less strong connections to people in politics and people in industry and people, I guess, in NGOs.
I wouldn't say I have connections to these. The most apparent for me is that I have these colleagues working on not necessarily also the deep sea, but also shallow or just marine science colleagues that feel the closest, because obviously, professionally we do have events that we attend together, or we sit, in the buildings that are close to each other. And then all the other groups are a bit outside of that. So it feels, we might rarely get actually to be in close proximity with the political world. And sometimes it's hard to know what is going on there, what it takes to negotiate questions there. And
okay, well then let's jump into some of the more philosophy of science topics that we're going to talk about. So you've pointed out that knowledge doesn't always simplify decisions in deep sea mining. So I think that's interesting, because so much of the conversation is about kind of arguing or disagreements over what the best science is on whatever the topic is at hand. Need for minerals, plumes, existence of resources, or whatever. And so it's not obvious to me, like in all of these, the underlying assumption is, well, we just need more science, better science, communication, and eventually we'll solve this disagreement or uncertainty.
Yeah.
Okay, so then make the opposing argument that sometimes more knowledge isn't necessarily better.
Yes. It could be, it's not about better or worse, but it's just what it brings to the table. And we know from other fields, for example, climate science, that more knowledge often brings more uncertainties and more complexity. And increasing knowledge, I mean, in a basic sense, it feels like if we increase knowledge, we know just better. So there's less complexity and less uncertainty. But the world is not as simple. So the more we know, the more we realize how complex things are, how they are connected. And there are many examples here, and the ocean is vast body.
So you're saying that with every additional piece of knowledge, that generally leads to just more questions.
Yes.
Which, I mean, in one sense, that reduces the feeling of certainty, but it can be argued that it actually, in the beginning, you had a very little bit of knowledge and a big feeling of certainty, but it was it was unsupported, unsubstantiated certainty. And then you learn something, and then you see a little bit farther, and you see how much more you have to learn. And so then you get the increased feeling of uncertainty, but it still seems to me like, okay, but that's improvement, or that's like better to be more aware of your...
Yeah, definitely. It's good to be aware. And that's the point. Getting more knowledge is not being less aware, but becoming more aware that we know less than we thought. So in very basic generalization, if I would say, if we know more about geology, then we potentially will know more about, resources in the deep sea. So increasing geological knowledge might feel like we will know better, is this economically viable or not? So for Norway being in undiscovered resource stage, it's important to gather that knowledge. And in resource assessments, it makes sense that the more you know, the better you understand the system and how the mineralization works in the deep. So by contrast, in biology, we get to know things that lead to understanding that it's very complex and uncertain how things might work. So the increasing knowledge of biology might be, leading towards realizing, it can be very tricky to affect one part of the specific habitat or ecosystem, and then it might, trickle and spread somewhere we didn't even know where. And being in the Norwegian continental shelf, the mid-ocean ridge, for example, has a lot of endemism, which means the animals that exist there exist only there and nowhere else. So that's in itself is also a specific knowledge that, I don't know, how do we decide what do we sacrifice? Which part of or which component can be just plucked out, and we just expect that things will work as they work. So in some disciplines or in some scientific topics, increasing knowledge does give us better understanding. In some other topics, it just makes things more scary, even, I would say, because then with more knowledge, we realize, wow, we really didn't know this, and this is important.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, especially the history of deep sea mining, where, long ago, I don't know how long ago, maybe in the 70s, there was the assumption that there essentially wasn't any life down at these depths. And so that was a kind of a very simplified picture and a much easier picture to deal with. And then we learn, okay, there's some life there, and we'll start to investigate how to deal with that. And then, like you say, if we find out that, oh, actually, there's a whole bunch of microenvironments that are maybe each significantly unique or significantly different from one another. So then we need to now start having assessments at the very micro scale to understand this particular small region. And then you get an explosion of uncertainty, I suppose.
Yeah. So it would be great to have a biologist sitting next to us and debate this with us, of course. But for my work, I only look at how this knowledge is put into policymaking, work, and how, policymakers need to understand these things to decide, okay, how do we manage? How do we regulate these things, such as new industries that are emerging? So...
Yeah, and I mean, that often to me seems like a black box as to how... So I'm very interested in, like, how do you study that, how science gets into decision-making? Is it possible to kind of know this and follow it for specific cases? Like, oh, here's a decision that was made, and we can see which knowledge sources actually got incorporated into the decision, or is it murkier than that?
It is quite murky, I would say, but also parts of it are quite clear. So there are different approaches to study this. You can do interviews with people and look for some sort of patterns in those interviews. So I would say, just in a very basic sense, to me, natural and social science are similar in some ways because we all collect data and look for patterns. That's the very basic thing, right? So looking at how science kind of enters policymaking, there are approaches like interviews, looking at documents, looking at media, for example, articles, and looking how the political debate is happening in media. So there's a range of things one can do. What I did with my colleague Laura Drivdal, we looked at the documents. So Norway has all this opening process, and the government is transparent. So all the documents from start to this point are public. Everyone can access them. And these are great as a resource in itself. These documents are great because they do show how we go from specific reports provided by some sort of scientific or expert organization, like, for example, the University of Bergen, the Center for Deep Sea Research. They provided one of the reports that then went to inform the big impact assessment. So we looked at that, and you can actually see how different inputs kind of move from one document to the other document. And then you can see how things happen. And things not only happen within the document, but also you can see how content of documents impacts some real world things. So kind of reshape a bit of the process itself. And that's one way of tracking it. And then, of course, the impact assessment in Norway ends up being this white paper that informs the parliament's decision. And parliament does not decide only on the white paper, which is written up to inform the vote, but there's also negotiations at the parliament.
So I didn't realize you did an assessment of this actual decision-making process, because I've spoken with some I've spoken with some scientists who had input to that process at various stages, and the kind of feelings after the fact that I heard sometimes was, I don't understand what information they used to make this decision, because the information we gave them all kind of pointed to one thing, and then the decision went another way. And so there was this obscurity, at least in the feelings. And of course, that makes sense because the scientists maybe are focused on their one slice of the picture, and that slice of the picture says that we should go in one direction, but then other parts of the picture have to come together in the minds of the... So the question is, do you feel like you have an understanding of how that decision was made? Like, can you trace information to decision? Or, or is it like, well, there's a disjoint here that we just will never really know?
Yeah. I mean, part of it, we can kind of trace it. So there are at least two important examples that come from these documents. One is, for example, that the impact assessment basically translates this scientific input into this policy-making language. So for a policymaker to know specific animal or where it is, so what its function in the ecosystem is, doesn't help. Which means that in Norway, there are a lot of ocean management plans and approaches. How do we put this scientific thing into this policy management, managerial kind of thing? So what happened in the impact assessment, for example, there's a table of impacts that translates the scientific knowledge into impacts, and this table actually is taken from a management plan for the Barents Sea. So that area is actually shallow water. I wouldn't call that deep sea, and that's already one problematic thing. So there is a management plan for the Barents Sea, and it has a table of impacts that range from small to not enough knowledge. And this is how science becomes kind of management language. So there is some sort of specific report on what we know about the ecosystem, and then we can put it into this table of different impacts. So some will be small impacts, some would be medium from what we know the science tells us. And this is what happens. So the impact assessment basically has this table. And in one instance, the inactive vent mining will have a small impact on benthic communities. This is what appears in the impact assessment. And then we can trace it back to the reports that inform this table. And we can see that actually in the reports that inform this, There's a study taken out of context from shallow water that says, in shallow water up to 30-meter depth, there is this quite speedy recolonization of fauna on pile cuttings, which is not really relevant for the deep sea and inactive vent mining, but we can trace that actually there is a study taken out of context that actually is put into this table, and this is why the impact of inactive vent mining has a small impact on benthic communities. So kind of going through the documents, it's possible to trace how some things were taken out of context or misunderstood, or and then it's informing the white paper. So the impact assessment informs the white paper, that informs the parliament's vote. And then the parliament, will not potentially do this detective work of how things happen. But, this table is a major informative thing that transforms scientific knowledge into very understandable managerial kind of knowledge.
Yeah. So in that instance, there's kind of two mechanisms happening that lead to misunderstanding. One is just kind of the game of telephone that has to happen when you are trying to condense knowledge. Each study has to look at previous studies and summarize and try to put that into language that people can understand. And then secondly is the kind of desire to have something to say. If you're tasked with making a study and there isn't any information on benthic communities at 3 kilometers deep, but there is information at 300 meters deep,
30 meters,
30 meters deep, well, then you want to put that in there because, okay, well, this is the best information that we have. I don't want to come to you empty-handed and just say, I don't know. So you put that information in, and then this game of telephone happens, and then things get misrepresented. And I think that's, especially to people who don't work in science, important to realize that this happens kind of all the time. And once you have a little bit of experience having to make a report, you start to think, okay, where could that, not even where did that data come from, but where could that data have come from? And you start to become naturally suspicious of data that seems like, oh, that would be really hard to know. So I should go and look deeper into that.
So ideally, I guess some of the scientists who produced these reports, they felt that we were potentially misunderstood or things didn't go as we thought it will go. And again, I think it's not like people didn't want this impact assessment to be written up at all or to be presented to the parliament, but a transparent way to do it, and based on the original table, which appears for the Barents Sea, one labels of what is the scale of impact is not enough knowledge. So the best choice based on what is known actually is not enough knowledge, rather than, for example, small impact, right? So you can see that they use the table in a way that maybe some scientists thought that's not a proper way also of using the table itself.
And I guess also there's the issue of the interpretation of the decision that was made at the end of the process. So in this case, at the end of the process, the government opened for activity, and we don't have to get too deep into the issue of how confusing that was, because I have a couple of conversations with others that we get into that. But you're saying that when you did this research, it seemed like the decision that was made kind of was based on some data that was garbled at some point. But it also could be that the people who made this decision decided that, okay, yeah, I understand there's uncertainty here, and so we're going to open for the kind of activity that allows more research to happen. And then that's the decision that they made, but that decision got garbled when it got implemented or interpreted later.
Yeah, that's one of the reasonable explanations. But for many people, I think, even in the public hearings, some people stress the fact that it's not only not enough knowledge that we need to gather, but also not enough of regulatory preparedness. So we don't have solid, robust exploration framework that guides what can be done, what shouldn't be done, because exploration itself can have effects on the ecosystem. And Norway doesn't have nodules, so the main interest here is in vent mining. It means that even during exploration phase, there are things that can be done that can impact the vent system negatively. So without these kind of regulations and guidelines, people try to say, look, there are these various things that could inform this, but Norway doesn't have, how to say, regulations. So the exploration itself is not defined, which is also highly problematic in itself.
Yeah, and that answers a question that I often have about this, which is, it seems like there's just a lack of trust in that the government will do what it says. So you talk to people who are opposed to the government decision, they say, well, yeah, the government's just thrown open for exploitation. Yeah, sure, they say that they can stop exploitation at some point, but really they won't. They won't be able to say no to the companies once they've invested. And then people who support what the government has done says, no, we're all saying that there has to be an exploration phase before the exploitation phase, and that's what's been decided. So what are you complaining about? And what I'm hearing you say, which is helpful, is that, yeah, but if you're going to do this, you have to have a framework for the exploration phase. So it's not just that we don't trust that you're going to stop at the end of the exploration phase. We also don't trust that the exploration phase is going to be done responsibly because you haven't laid out a framework for how to do it responsibly.
Yes. And it's not necessarily about responsibility. It's again about knowing what we do. And since it's such an emerging new industry idea that is on the level of hopes at the moment, I guess, it's also the fact that for the scientific community, the deep sea in Norway is really underexplored area. So there's little work done. It's not necessarily that we go there and do something how to say, intentionally wrong, but we might not know that we're doing something wrong. So this is why some people are worried that the exploration needs quite, how to say, well-regulated steps of, for example, how to take a specific sample, because drilling a vent system can affect a nearby system. So there's...
Yeah, and we should just be specific. We're talking about drilling. Everyone is talking about drilling extinct vent systems. No one is proposing going and drilling active vent systems, which is something that everybody likes to be specific about, because I think that's one of the...
This is a great point. So there's difference between inactive and active vents. But from research in the international research in the international seabed and then research on vents does show that inactive and active vents are connected. So, for example, the vents that are known in Norway up to date that were found during different stages of research cruises, all the inactive vents that are known, they are in very close proximity to the active ones. So it's easy to say that, you know, we're not interested in active ones that have this lively animal community. We are interested in these inactive ones, but there's little research on the inactive ones because it's much more interesting to look at this lively community of active vents. So basically researchers, it's a very shallow, of course, generalization, but researchers were always more interested in the active ones. So it means we have even less understanding of what an inactive vent means. And if we look up some of the people who do research vent systems, for example, Cindy Van Dover, which has really good papers on this topic. She even explains why, for example, it's not correct to call inactive vent a dead vent, because we don't know if it's permanently ceased activity or if we will just restart it if something happens. So it's a very, how to say, kind of lively system of vents that some parts are maybe, you know, not actively spewing, you know, not actively having activity, but it's all interconnected. And this is what we don't know. So it's not even easy to make that distinction and say, oh, we will take samples only from these. But by taking sample, actually, you might reactivate the system itself. This is the problem. But again, for me, this is a very basic understanding that I have, and I can read what people say, and I need to trust these people that are experts and that do research on this. But for me, it's always about thinking, okay, so if this is how we talk, how biologists talk about it, so how do actually policymaker needs to understand it, and how a policymaker can actually take that, and how they need then to inform some sort of framework or write up some sort of set of, you know, steps or rules, how the exploration phase needs to happen.
What is your take on the deep sea mining question? Like, are you a neutral scientist, or do you have a opinion about, I don't know, about the Norwegian situation, about whether or not deep sea mining ought to or ought not go forward? And then we'll get into whether it's appropriate for someone like you to have an opinion or to own that opinion.
Yeah. I think this is a very hard question for me. And the fact that people like me or my colleagues, for example, when they get trained into doing some sort of research on policymaking, for example, along the years, I feel at least I got so fixated on the fact that it's so fascinating and interesting to look at how policymaking works that I actually don't think too much, do I support this or that question or do I disprove it? So for me, first of all, this whole topic is in itself interesting from the perspective of doing research. It's very interesting that, you know, the government is faced with the decision that, okay, there is this new industry idea on the table. What do we do with it? So it's fascinating in itself.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never thought about that before, but yeah, just as you become more, whatever, scientifically interested in a topic, I guess you become, in a way, a bit more naturally neutral because you're interested in just discovering the mechanisms of how these things work.
Yeah.
So at least part of you, it can be detached from, was this a good result? Was this a good approach? And just, oh, it's interesting that this led to that outcome.
Because the material itself that we get to explore not necessarily gives a good answer. Is this, you know, for or against? Should we do it or shouldn't we do it? Yeah, there are a lot of problems in the whole discussion and in all the, you know, things that, you know, professional experts and scientific experts come and explore. That there's a lot going on, but many of these things do not even give an answer. Should this move on or not? Because the main, for example, discussion in Norway in the scientific community was that, well, this is going too fast. So it's not about, this shouldn't happen. For many of the people, this wasn't the thing to talk about. It just happens too fast. And we need, you know, there are steps that are missed for us to be able to proceed. So this is my feeling as well, that I don't know. And the thing with deep sea mining, it's at such an early stage that for me it doesn't even seem like I need to have an opinion. It's just too early to even think. I mean, being in undiscovered resource stage, so this whole debate about the resource assessment being, in technical terms, a speculative one, because there's a high uncertainty of, you know, of the economic viability and minerals there and where these vents are. So it feels it's very early. But of course, a lot of information pieces point that maybe not. And know well that we didn't do good in the past with many industries. So should we move on? Probably not. We have plenty of lessons that signal at not.
Yeah, okay, so then more directly, with your researcher hat on, is it appropriate for you to voice, let's say, normative stance on the topic that you are scientifically researching?
Yeah, I think this question bothered people for a long time. And one of the last papers that I read on this topic was from Sandra Harding, where she kind of explains that scientific neutrality is not, it doesn't exist. It's just not there. And the better way to approach the question is to basically be very transparent about your position, what you do, why you do it, how you do it, instead of pretending I'm just neutral component in the whole thing. I just, extract some data, analyze it, and then just, plug it into this government machine that will make the decision. It's not me. Yes, scientists do not make the decisions, but if you are a major piece in the machine that informs the final decision, you are not neutral. You are, part of the whole process. So it's good to think in terms of, okay, what is my role here? What decisions do I inform, and how do I inform them? I think it's very normal way of existing as a scientist. And in some cases, my colleagues did say that where they were kind of questioned, are they neutral or not, as if this is some sort of guiding indicator of the quality of your work. But that's the point. Neutrality does not equal quality of work, right? So instead of debating this neutrality and who is neutral and who is not, we should just maybe discuss more about how the work is quality or not.
Yeah.
And in a very basic sense, and that's the last point on this topic, at least from my end, is that the whole deep sea mining debate arises from one document, which is the Law of the Sea. And the Law of the Sea is a political document. So whatever flows out of it is political in a sense. If you work for, if the government desires or decide or thinks should it open or not for a new industry, and your work informs that, and Norway is part of the Law of the Sea, so it's a signatory, it means, this is all connected. So it's all a political question, and being neutral is kind of impossible.
Yeah, so I totally I agree that true neutrality is essentially impossible unless you're really studying something that doesn't meaningfully relate to anything that you care about. And then you say we should get away from using neutrality as a marker for quality, but we should just try to go straight to quality. And I think about this and I think, yeah, but neutrality is one of the heuristics because it's really difficult to judge quality directly. You get presented with a fact. And I mean, one of my heuristics, which I'm very aware of, is, does it seem like this fact is presented in a way that skews it to try to make me make a conclusion? I mean, sometimes I feel like it must be counterproductive, especially in this deep sea mining case. You see people putting out these arguments and fact sheets and whatever social media posts that are so heavily skewed that you're like, well, I can see your bias so clearly that it's overriding my assessment of the fact, and now I'm suspicious of the fact. The neutrality, we use it as a heuristic for quality, and then if we were to try to set that aside, how could we assess quality without essentially duplicating the research ourselves?
Yes. I think one good example of this quality debate was about the resource assessment that came out almost in parallel to the impact assessment. So the resource assessment was produced by the old directorate, which is, they changed the name, so now it's Offshore Directorate. And unlike the impact assessment, which was open for public inputs and public hearing, the resource assessment wasn't open. It just was basically presented, but there was no public hearing for it. But still, a lot of professional people related to this work, they raised concerns. So there was this whole discussion among different organizations, including the Offshore Directorate, regarding the quality of the assessment. And that's a good example because, other professional bodies who work, for example, in resource calculations, it was involving university people, but also bodies like the Norwegian Geological Survey. So they said, this is probably not the best way of doing it, or there are some corners cut here. And yeah, we don't need to produce a second resource assessment, but we have this extended, good professional network in Norway that does have expertise on the topic. And this debate was very healthy. So it means, the samples are there that were used to make some of the calculations of, for example, how many tons of specific mineral exists in the seabed. So we know the samples, we know the calculation. There is no need to remake it. And I think that was really nice discussion to follow and to read from different opinions of different experts why this is not the quality we expect in the professional community.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of where we can look for markers of quality outside of perceived neutrality, which is, like you say, there's this peer review kind of process which can take place in the official journal kind of process where there's actual kind of blind peer review, but there's also just peer review out in public where you put something out, either organized, like you say, where there's a hearing process and people give feedback and then there's adjustment, or there's an informal process where you put something out and then hopefully experts in the field will comment on it and say, okay, well, actually, I have some questions about this. Yes. And then the other part of that is transparency of data and method. So if they make a statement and you can click and find their Excel file and look at the data and then see the calculation, and those are other markers of quality. Even if you can't necessarily do the calculation, knowing that the data is available is one of the ways.
And I guess for me, it's important to also kind of explicitly state that, if a professional body puts out any report, it's not that this body is, somehow, having some closed, intransparent thoughts and they try to push this out. But it's very good to be open, we all make mistakes, all the professional networks. This is why we have these wide professional networks. And if they function well, we learn from each other, we get feedback, we improve things.
Yeah, no, that's good to explicitly state. I feel like that's something that, the obvious place where trust in science was really problematic in the last few years was this whole COVID debate, where there was suddenly a whole lot of skepticism over expert opinions and people doing their own research and all of that. And it was very difficult, I think, for a lot of people to try to navigate that. And so, so not only are you pointing to peer review and open data, but also just like, there's a reason why we have networks of scientists, and we have to have there is a role for like this collective knowledge process, which is just scientists interacting with each other in all the forum that there are.
A good point here as well, maybe to wrap up, maybe if we move to another question, it's that it's not only, for example, when there's a resource assessment, it's not only the geologist that should have a say, right? Because the first question on the table is why we need these minerals. So there are all these, networks of researchers that do exactly research on energy transformation. So one of the reasons in the impact assessment in Norway was that, well, this is for energy transition purposes. Although in the impact assessment itself, they rightfully acknowledge that we don't know where these minerals will be used for what purposes in what specific, technologies, for example. So they give a reason why, but they also are transparent about that we don't know why exactly. So, inviting those people to the table who do research on energy transformation, we might get some answers as to why this is needed. So the width and breadth of this kind of professional community is not about also these pockets of expertise on specific topics, but broader expertise that is needed. We might kind of fixate, okay, we are, calculating minerals, digging minerals, and then it's a very narrow, thing. But if we invite this broader community, we might, find questions that should be first before we even calculate what we have is, for what purposes.
Yeah. Okay. So then there's three directions we can go from that. One is kind of the difficulty of multidisciplinarity. But maybe a more constrained topic is just the role of public versus private funding in research. So in this community of scientists and this need to get more research done, there's just a serious question of who's going to pay for it. And can we trust that people who are being paid from private interests are going to be doing science in a neutral way, in a high quality way, and then that they're going to make that publicly available?
Yeah, I think this is a very broad question, and it does bother many people. And it's, again, we come with a baggage of how we perceive, what it means to have independent science and what it means to have industry-funded science. So there is also research on that. And I think even in Norway, there, public already has an opinion what they think about independent science as opposed to, industry-funded science. So there are all these, really broad debates that need to be considered. One reason given in Norway is that it will be faster. So the hope is that, if we put academia and industry together, it will be faster. We will gather more data and we will have more data. There are quite problematic things with this approach, that gathering data and extracting data is not the same as analyzing data. So the capacity to collect data is one thing, but capacity to analyze it is another thing. So there is also this understanding in deep sea mining community that, there's a limit of how much we can collect because we will not be able to analyze it. So it depends on the question at hand, which specific thing we want to explore and for what purposes. Do we need this collaboration? Is it increasing the speed? Is it increasing the speed of understanding? Because the knowledge comes after analyzing the data. So having, tons of data doesn't have you have any understanding of what is going on or what it is about. Having raw data doesn't mean anything for you as an expert that has the data, but also, for broader public, because we are promised this will be transparent. So we should know what we gathered, what we have, right? So if it all moves in parallel, an expert that has terabytes of data, they can't say much to the public except that there is this large body of data.
Right. And then, now let's talk about this issue of communication across disciplines, because obviously each or different questions are best answered by different subfields, and we're all aware of this problem of siloing in science. And I think that it's been pointed out to me that the deep sea mining question, and I don't know if this is just because this is a question that I have now gotten deep enough into to see that siloing is a real problem. Or maybe it's something about the early stage of this where disciplines are more related to one another for some reason. But yeah, can you talk about, I guess, just from a philosophy of science perspective, what are the challenges of multidisciplinary collaboration?
Yes. So again, full disclosure, I'm not from philosophy of science, but I do belong to this group of people and I learn a lot from them. But in a very like basic sense, for me, my work is about science for policy. So science for policy interface, or how science informs policy or political debates. This is again very tricky question, and silos do exist. Sometimes they exist in the same office building, in the same from office to office, from lab to lab, and it's very unintentional. Oftentimes people are not on purpose building these walls between themselves, but especially in academia, you have expectations to produce specific work, to produce specific outputs. So you are very much, focused on that. There's sometimes little space for us to think, okay, how do I speak to this colleague of mine who works on something similar, but, different? So how do, for example, me, someone who explores policymaking in the deep sea mining topic, how do I, even approach these people in biology? How do I, tell them what I do? And we know that, and this is very human, even in our own work, for example, we trust some specific data collection method more than the other. For example, I feel that, interviews might be way more informative than, for example, surveys. So we already, with our own, bubble, we already have things that we believe works better. But then we need to speak to these other people who have very different, methods and approaches to doing what it means to make, a well-designed research project, what it means to collect quality data.
Yeah. No, I work in a small group that has a mix of social scientists and kind of more hard, like data science people. And we have had just clear misunderstandings just over what the word data means. And, social scientists are talking about interview data and the kind of like words in a spreadsheet and the number of concepts in a spreadsheet, and the data scientists are like, where are the numbers here? I don't know how to make sense of data without it being explicitly
numerical.
Yeah, numerical, yes. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, but then from the political science question, is it important that researchers can understand one another, or isn't it just like, wouldn't the system just work if everyone does good research in their silo and then they hand the results upwards, and there's some synthesizer who plucks all of the findings from the various
disciplinary kind of bubbles.
Exactly. And whatever, synthesizes that and hands it up to the policymakers, and then the policymakers are making the decision anyway, and they can talk one-on-one to the siloed researcher. So why do the researchers need to talk to one another?
Yes. Yeah, this is a great question, and I think a lot of people have been thinking about it for years, and a lot of ink has been spilled to explain what are these different approaches for us to exist as a scientific community. So there's this interdisciplinarity debate and how it should work, and how should we talk and integrate these different things from different fields. Transdisciplinarity, which invites, people from outside of academic bubble. So, we should actually collaborate with broader professional community, and maybe local communities, because, for example, the coast on the ocean coast is, we live on coast, right? A lot of us live on the coast, so maybe local communities should be integrated on some research projects, because you can't just pretend, the coast is a lab, a pure space that doesn't have humans. There is, this whole debate how to properly do a single research project, who should be involved and how. And I think I've seen really good and nice stories about how including this broader community actually improves quality. So again, if we want to have a quality output, actually integrating these seemingly different communities with different understanding what it means to gather something and to make an output of something, it's really good thing. So the same, again, I think in the scientific community, at some point, and that might be my naive understanding, at some point I think geologists and biologists realize that they need to be together, because in the deep sea, a lot of biology actually is dependent on the geology. So it's not that there is this endemic animal community there by itself and it's unique. It's there because there is a unique geology. So then, okay, let's join these forces together and let's talk to each other. Let's see how you perceive, this specific ecosystem and how I perceive it.
Yeah, I think that's an important, message to keep in mind, is that these distinctions between disciplines are inherently artificial. There isn't a line between biology and geology. Like you say, these things interact at all sorts of levels. And so we need to be aware that even if you wanted to only stay within your field, you would even need to look outside of your field for additional information. So then I never know how to ask this question, but I think very central, and actually what drew me to the deep sea mining debate in the first place, was that this is a particular topic where value judgments are like very deeply entwined into, it seems to me, most of the kind of scientific discussions that are happening. I remember going to like a conference session on the engineering solutions for deep sea mining, and people just spent half the time talking about the ethics of deep sea mining. And I feel like this, like the conversation slides back and forth quite often, and I don't know if that's kind of rightly or wrongly, between the things that we're learning and then how those things get applied to the different values that different people kind of bring to the discussion. So the main question is, when we are in a situation like this where we're trying to make a decision and we've got different facts contributing to different values, but also just different values that themselves don't compare to one another. And I know you have written on this at least a little bit in at least one of your publications. So how do you think, what are good methodologies, what are reasonable approaches for making decisions in situations where you have to compare between kind of non-comparable value categories?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question, and I don't feel like I am anywhere close to being an expert to giving an answer. But I mean, one way is to go back to this question, why we should do it. So not the technology, not the biological impacts, not the economic viability, which are all topics that are basically in a very making baby steps in understanding, okay, what is it that we are doing here? But the question is why we are doing it, right? And the proper way would be, right, to have this, public debate about it, and political debate about it. Some would say it didn't happen, and it's happening kind of, it's trying to catch up with these developments. So the public debate is basically dragging behind these conversations about what kind of technology or, how to talk and research impacts.
Like at a kind of a technical mathematical level, part of the question is just like, how do we compare between these different values? If we find out that there's so much damage to, or so much potential damage to a mining operation to an ecosystem, and then we try to either compare that to a damage elsewhere, which I see you've written about, like can we even compare ecosystem effects across ecosystems, but that at least is in the same value category. Or, which a very common framing is like, well, we're basically trading off ecosystem damage against human benefit or human welfare or bringing people out of poverty or whatever. And then you can get into the details of that. But at a certain level, there's this comparison. And so one answer that I heard you say was, well, one way we make that comparison is kind of democratically and in public conversation. So it's not perfect, it's not mathematical, but you let people voice what they care about in public conversations, and then hopefully the decision makers hear that and respond to it.
Yes.
So then with your political assessment hat on, it's decision makers at the end of the day that political decision makers in some cases that kind of have to do this.
Yeah.
It's all well and good to say, well, that's not comparable and you have your opinion and I have my opinion, but at the end of the day, these people have to make it a decision. So how do they mechanistically bring that in?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great complex question and we do live with it, inside of it. Maybe a good way to look at it is to first of all think of all of this not as something new that we suddenly discovered and need to debate about, but to think of it from the, historical context and perspective, to just look in the context of all the debates that we had up till now. And there were plenty of debates and discussions in many of different, topics that relate to the environment and human well-being. So this is not something new here, right? We are at the table and we discussed this since, let's say, the 70s. The strongest, I think, influencers on this debate come from 60s and 70s. Again, if, for example, one topic that has been extensively debated is the precautionary principle. It's been debated well enough and it's already in some of the legal documents that exist internationally and nationally. So we already know. We talked about it. We kind of agreed what it is about. And we did already put it in some documents that should guide our future kind of ideas about new industries, for example. And in a very basic sense, the precautionary principle is basically for the protection of the environment. So if you have any doubts, then, favor nature. That's very shallow description of what it is. And one of the components of kind of that tells us we should take precaution is uncertainty. So when there's high degree uncertainty and we feel that there might be negative impacts that we can't control, precautionary principle is the answer. So
let me just the way that I think of that precautionary principle. So two things. I think that some people will emphasize that in some places, the precautionary principle kind of explicitly says not having enough information isn't a reason to not do anything. So like you say, we've debated this and it does get kind of, and when you write it out, I guess, then you have to formulate it. And those formulations are a helpful indication of the debate that led to them. So I guess when you look at the formulation in different contexts, you'll see, okay, here they kind of explicitly said no information or lack of information isn't a reason to do nothing, and then maybe if they leave that out in another context, then that indicates that actually we should be even more conservative. And then, yeah, I don't disagree with your framing that a very simplified way is to just say, when in doubt, kind of preserve nature. But I think that that's essentially because it's like, when in doubt, don't break things you can't fix. And natural ecosystems are just an example of things that we have a very hard time putting back together once we break them. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems, well, from the examples we have so far, it seems, do we have a good example where we put things together and kind of, we broke something and then we patch it up and it continued functioning as it originally functioned? Maybe there are such examples, I don't know. But it feels we do not have. So it reminds me of this debate about mitigation in the deep ocean. So mitigation is one of these technical terms, I guess, and there are different stages of mitigation. So yeah, if we break something, how do we fix it? Or how do we avoid breaking something? So do we do it slower or more carefully and maybe break only parts of it? So this is what mitigation is about, and it's also very simplified way. But the only experiment that I know in the deep sea exists in the international seabed. So that's with in fields with nodules, which Norway doesn't have nodules. But that could be an indicative kind of study that should or could inform Norwegian debate, right? So there are these ceramic artificial nodules in some plots, and the scientists are basically looking, okay, so can we have these maybe artificial nodules spread around in areas where we remove them? And again, this is a single experiment, and it's very recently deployed experiment, so it's very, how to say, fresh and new, and we do not know much. I've heard the brilliant scientist behind it is Sabine Göllner, and she presented preliminary work on it, and it seems tricky. It seems that nature knows the difference between ceramic nodule and a polymetallic nodule.
Yeah, and this question of mitigation and of restoration always takes me just kind of back to values, because you never kind of get, well, here is the natural situation and then we disturb it and then we're going to try to return it all the way back to its natural. It's like, well, we're going to disturb it and then we're going to bring it into a new state, which will become kind of the future endemic environment. And I mean, moving to Norway from Canada is something that I always notice. Is like the landscape here is so affected by so much longer time period of having, for one thing, sheep grazing and just people kind of living on the land.
Yes.
And so you go out into the forest here, and it's very natural. It doesn't feel like this is totally disturbed, but you see signs that this state of nature is because of the interaction of whatever human activity. And so that's also going to be the kind of decisions that we have to make in a lot of these questions is which third state are we going to accept?
Willing, yes.
Yeah.
And again, a great point here is not to forget that there was this all vibrant and lively debate about BBNJ agreement. So the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, all hard work that was put into it. People were, discussing things in the middle of the night. There was a lot of work that was put into it, right? It means we already agreed that we value biodiversity, right? So it's already debated. It's already there. We don't need to make this discussion again in the context of deep sea mining topic, right? We just need to take all those lessons and all that hard work and see, okay, this is how we look at it. So if this is how we look at it, okay, so what do we do now with this question of deep sea mining?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point also, that the specifics of the deep sea mining debate aren't unique to the deep sea mining debate. It's there's applicable principles, applicable findings,
Yes.
applicable details from all sorts of other topics, and we need to integrate.
Yeah, and sometimes these are well integrated, but sometimes, at least from my perspective, when I observe some of the discussions, it feels, wow, we are excluding all this, really relevant expertise that should be right, at the table. So, yeah, sometimes it feels like we do include a lot, but we do exclude a lot as well. And in some instances, it feels people would say, but in deep sea mining, we still don't have literature on this and that, but we do not need that literature. It already exists. So it feels oftentimes, people would say, oh, what minerals we need and for what purposes. The deep sea literature doesn't give an answer for that. There's plenty of terrestrial mining literature on these topics. So it's like some people would say, we need specifically literature that talks about deep sea mining and integrates this. But they forget, well, there is no to replicate this research. It already exists.
Then what about when you think about assessing the decision-making process, how do you think about identifying the location of decision-making? So I feel like in the Norwegian context, a lot of people focus on this kind of like specific decision by parliament to approve something. And then in the deep sea mining kind of debate, people talk as if there's like we should either put a moratorium or we should allow deep sea mining or we shouldn't. And the conversation talks as if there is a person or an organization or a we who is going to make this decision. And so when you're assessing how these decisions get made, do you have trouble like identifying like, okay, this is the important decision that actually matters, or like even the decision-making process just so distributed that it's hard to pin down?
Yeah, I mean, it is distributed well, and it's hard to pin down this, like, how to say, the major peak or this powerful node that kind of shapes everything or holds everything together. Many things are very important. So if the scientific community would say, well, we're not doing research on this topic because we don't believe in it, we don't think it should happen, we just, if they're out of it, right, if there's this magical agreement, well, the government can't make much, can they? Because, again, based on the current legal landscape in Norway, its commitment to the law of the sea, being a party of it, its commitment to, having standards that are not lower than the standards that are discussed in the International Seabed Authority debates, then Norway is in trouble because the whole community that should inform this development is out. They are saying, we're not giving you any inputs. It cannot happen like that, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
It's not realistic, but the fact is that this community is a major component that, builds and holds this base together on which the decision can be made.
Yeah, so even if you can identify the locus of a decision,
yes,
there's a whole bunch of kind of subsidiary or supporting loci that are also powerful in the decision-making process.
Yeah, I would say so, yeah. So, of course, there are probably these more powerful nodes. So, for example, the parliament, right? In a democratic country like Norway, of course, it's not the vote among scientists, should we or shouldn't we open the continental shelf, but it's the parliament's decision. So if all these kind of components function well, we end up with a decision that should be relatively well understood and accepted in a larger community, in the public, in the professional community.
Do you also follow the and study the ISA decision-making process?
Some of it, but not. This is not my primary research focus here at the University of Bergen, but part of it we do follow. It's not only me, but it's also some of my colleagues, and it's not like I can't say it's a single work because we also discuss a lot of it. So it's at some point it feels like a work of a group rather than me alone. But there is no official kind of team that works on it. But we do follow, we discuss it, we kind of are interested in it because it's important for many reasons, for national developments. Again, because Norway is a signatory of the Law of the Sea, so it means we need to understand what happens in these international negotiations and in the development of the mining code for the international seabed. We need to understand how these kind of feed back into these national level discussions. So it's important to have a reasonable understanding of what's going on there to understand how things happen on the national level.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you're able to comment on structurally the ISA, are they able to make decisions, or are they too distributed, too many actors? Is it a well set up and properly functioning system for its purpose?
I think there are people who research this specific topic. Is it a good system? Does it function well? And I've read some papers. It's a good system in the sense that, there are all these delegations there. So it feels like quite inclusive system that everyone is at the table, because the international seabed, according to the Law of the Sea, legally the international seabed is the heritage of humankind, right? So it belongs to all of us. So it seems that, the best way to discuss what this means and how to proceed is, of course, all these delegations that gather together and represent us as citizens of various countries. But then, of course, all these works that explore how this all happens do point out there are a lot of problems. Many countries they are signatories, but they do not come to these meetings. For various reasons. Some countries do not have the capacity, some countries do not have the finances, and there are, of course, ways of, financing some delegations, and it happens. But there are a lot of reasons why not everyone participates, and that's already a problem. It's a good organization on one hand, and it's based on good ideas and good hopes of how this sort of body could function. But reality, of course, is different because, there are a lot of things there are challenging things of how this large body that brings a lot of governments together can function well. So, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're all aware that when it comes to decision making, there's just kind of an inherent trade-off between, like we talked about earlier, the amount of knowledge that you're able to incorporate, and then also the number of viewpoints. And it isn't that there's a right decision that is going to be best for everybody. It's that different classes of people are going to have different interests, and you have to balance between those interests.
Yes. And people rightfully say that the Law of the Sea itself was, the discussion about it and the negotiations about it happened long time ago. So, 60s, 70s. Those were times where, we had very different understanding of what is the deep sea. As you said, at that time we thought it's probably empty and there are all these minerals just waiting for us to pick them up. And along the years, of course, we have now very different understanding of what it is there, as well as we have very different understanding of, what it means to have some sort of commodity extracted. And, there are different debates talking that, for example, nature is not a commodity. So it's not about extracting just, minerals. It's, we come a long way since the original negotiation of the law of what we think about the ocean, what we know about it. So it's complicated because it's also about trying to kind of be still in line with this law, but also understand that it's in part outdated, and some people said that it's outdated. So it's really tricky.
Is there anything else that you feel we ought to cover before we wrap up? Is there any particular misunderstanding that you feel is common in the deep sea mining conversation that you would like to mention or straighten out?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of misunderstandings, and I think many of us who are discussing this together, for example, on social media, we often do know these differences in how we see why this is needed, for what purpose, who should do it, and how. We I think people are well aware about their opponents and why the opponents hold one or the other position. But in some instances, of course, there are misunderstandings. It's easy to forget that many of us have very similar goals, For many of us, it's just a question of, okay, what is this better future we want? And how do we go about it today that we make sure tomorrow will be better, not worse? I think for many people who are in favor and against deep sea mining, this is one common question that people have in mind. But again, this is just, being part of the community and being part of the discussion, and we can learn through that. It could be easy to forget that sometimes instead of assuming what the person thinks, it's better to ask what they think.
Yeah.
So there is this nice book by Walter Sinnoh Armstrong called Think Again, How to Reason and Argue. And he basically just has one easy way to go about these, conversations that sometimes end up just being people very, very argumentative and very, against each other. The one easy way to go about it is just to ask, do you really think what I assume you think?
Yeah, right. Let me rephrase what you think back to you, and you can tell me whether or not I've got it right. And I mean, this is what people put forward as a strategy is, okay, here's what I think you think, and then you tell me whether or not I've got that right before I then go on to...
So it's easy to conclude, this group is very different from me. I think this way, they think that way. Right. But often we think very in very similar terms. It's just the strategies or the solutions we have in mind are different. And then it's not an easy solution. If someone believes we need, for example, more minerals to decarbonize, right? It is seemingly a good and reasonable thing, right, in itself. But then, in deep sea mining, people would promote, for example, we need electric cars. And Oliver, one of your previous guests, I think very shortly and nicely put it, I hope, people can afford an electric car. I would like everyone to afford it, which is nice, but then it opens up all this space for the debate. Should we have more electric cars? Should we have more electric buses? Not all the countries have good public transportation. Not all countries, allow people to use, public transportation. So is it a question for better future? Is it about, how do we have these infrastructures that, provide services to us? Should we improve this infrastructure itself? Or should we stick to one specific industry, for example, automotive industry, and should we just, work on that? How do we, make sure that car industry survives? So then it becomes, very different of how we approach this. But initially, we can agree that, yes, it's a good idea to have actually electric car instead of, internal combustion engine car.
Yeah, well, I totally agree that most people in this conversation are coming to it from that initial starting point of how can we make a better future? How can we make tomorrow better than today? I like that phrasing. And I think it's quite an optimistic thing to remember when you're coming into this discussion is, okay, we all at least agree about this basic thing, and how do we get there from here, is probably a good place to wrap up. So is there anywhere, I mean, you've mentioned a number of good kind of books and sources, which I will include in the show notes, but is there anything else that you would point the listener to where they can follow up with some of the topics that we've discussed today?
Yeah, I think the first thing to me that always comes into mind, again, not to get fixated on, for example, what is the better technology or what is the better science, how much more data we would need, but again, not to forget that the question is why we do this at all. Why do we need it? And that debate really needs to, I think, be larger than it is now.
Great. Where can people follow you? Where are you most active online? Where do you...
I think I'm most active on LinkedIn because there are a lot of people there that I follow who work on deep sea mining or as part of the, industry or academia.
Mm-hmm.
So I really like to follow people to understand why they think what they think and why we do all this. And yeah, so if anyone would be interested, I'm probably there.
Yeah, you're certainly very active there. Yep. Okay, well then, thanks very much, Aiste, for your time today. I think it's been a very interesting conversation, and I hope we can do it again in the future.
Thank you, and welcome to Bergen. I hope you enjoy your time here.
Thanks.
I get tired after a while.